On this week's Talking Politics, why is Kemi Badenoch stoking adolescence conspiracy theories?
The programme is so powerful. I struggle how anyone could watch that and think about race.
She's pronouncing on a programme she hasn't watched.
The new fights in the tariff wars?
Really senior members of the White House team just openly say, look, we're hopeful that you and I can agree a deal, but don't count on Donald Trump then signing it off.
And how power has changed Rachel Reeves.
It did feel like she felt like she could let her hair down a little bit.
It shows the difference in tone between opposition and government, right?
The cares of office, right? It's astonishing the way they weigh on you.
Hello, I'm Paul Brand, sitting in for Tom, who's away this week. I'm joined by Robert and our digital political reporter, Lewis Denison, who are here to do the impossible. Talk about tariffs, which haven't even hit yet. We're recording this a few hours ahead of Donald Trump's announcement, but there's plenty to talk about nonetheless. And we want to start about something completely different to tariffs, which is Adolescence, which is the hit Netflix show, which lots of our listeners will have seen. Robert, you haven't watched it. I've watched it. Lewis has watched it. Someone else who hasn't watched it is Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah, I want to watch it. And, everybody tells me it's absolutely essential viewing at the moment, that it's not only having a big impact culturally, but politically. I was struck earlier this week that the Prime Minister wanted to talk about the importance of it. And as he welcomed, you'll have seen it. You can judge whether or not this is going to be helpful if it's shown in schools, but Netflix has, announced that it was going to be provided free to all schools.
Yeah.
And, obviously the Prime Minister thinks this will help combat the kind of toxic misogyny that a lot of, boys and adolescents are picking up, which is, obviously deeply shocking. This is obviously a big phenomenon.
Yeah, and talking of toxicity, it's also been weaponised by the anti-woke brigade, because people say, wrongly, that this drama is portrayed by a white boy who's the lead role, the boy who's accused of, or is actually convicted in the drama of killing a girl. Although he's white, the actor, it's based on a black kid who was also convicted of killing someone. Now, the writers have said that is not true. It's just not true. They didn't base it on any single person. But Kemi Badenoch has actually repeated this, hasn't she, Lewis?
It just feels totally irrelevant whether it's a white or a black person. The programme is so powerful. I struggle how anyone could watch that and think about race. And it's quite troubling that the leader of the opposition wants to talk about conspiracy theories rather than the issues that are raised in the programme. And I think, Keir Starmer's watched it. I know Bridget Phillipson's watched it because I interviewed her last week. It feels like the government's basing policy on this because of how powerful it is. So I just don't really see why the conspiracy even needs to be raised.
Just to be clear, just tell us what she said.
So she said that, from her understanding, it's been misportrayed because it's being based on. It's being portrayed by a white actor when actually it was a black person who committed the crime, even though, as I said, it isn't based on a true story.
It's just sort of but it boggles the mind that she might want to convey that idea.
I think she's seen these ideas raised on social media, and she's probably thought she can win quite a lot of support by voicing them.
It must be where she gets most of her news from, you'd imagine, because it's only on social media that I've seen this conspiracy doing the rounds. So that must be where she picked it up from, unless she took a deliberate political decision to feed the conspiracy and that she thought it was good politically for her.
The thing is, she hasn't watched it, so I feel like if she had have watched it, she might not feel those issues are worth raising, because the topics in the programme are so powerful and so relatable. We know these things are happening. We see these stories in the news all the time. And if Keir Starmer thinks it's a good idea for kids across the country to watch it, if it stops a handful of kids thinking like that, then I think it's a good idea.
But also, it runs totally counter to what she says her sort of big political shtick is. This is a party led by someone who is very explicitly saying, I have no policies at the moment because it was such a shock what happened the next election. We need to take a lot of time examining the evidence before we can, make any pronouncements in terms of policy. And yet she's pronouncing on a programme she hasn't watched. So those two approaches don't seem wholly consistent.
No. Well, we're going to comment now on something that we haven't seen, which is the Trump tariffs, which are yet to be announced as we record this podcast. But nevertheless, there's lots to talk about how Britain might react. So, Robert, what sense are you picking up in government about how Keir Starmer is likely to respond to these tariffs when they're announced?
The reality is that they are now reconciled, the government, that these tariffs will apply to the United Kingdom. They haven't given up hope that in the coming weeks we will be able to negotiate some kind of deal on trade. We'll have a more liberal approach to allowing American farm products into the UK, reduce tariffs. There are, talks that also cover things like technology, where we may be able to offer them stuff. Nobody in government has a clue when a deal of that sort may be agreed with Trump's officials. I've been talking to politicians and officials who've been over there having these negotiations. They say that really senior members of the White House team just openly say, look, we're hopeful that you and I can agree a deal, but don't count on Donald Trump then signing it off. So let's just say he does say broadly 20% tariffs on everything, right? And, let's say on the 20% tariff, 10% of that is absorbed in the form of lower profits by the producer. That's still 10% on the cost to American consumers of pretty much everything that they're going to buy if it happens to be sourced from the rest of the world. That's a huge hit to the cost of living for Americans.
People who live in America, are they better off than British people? Can they stomach paying an extra 10%?
So America's economy has expanded so much faster than Europe's economy, so much faster than the British economy. Living standards in America have risen very sharply over the last 10 years when ours have flatlined. But there is an extraordinary gap between rich and poor, right? So whereas there are astonishing numbers of Americans with huge incomes and huge wealth, there are also, in this very unequal society, very, very large numbers of people who don't feel well off, who do, basically struggle from paycheck to paycheck, who have nothing left at the end of the month. And actually a significant number of those people voted for Trump. So it will be absolutely fascinating to see, given that he's saying these tariffs come in immediately, if they start to squeeze the living standards of some of the people who voted for him, how much pressure that puts on him to change course.
As you know, we invite questions from our audience every single show. We've now received our first video message from one long-time listener, so we can play that now.
Hello, my name's Tom from Malta. Regular listener to the pod. I love the pod, so thank you very much for that. My question for you today, particularly for you, Robert, is that you talk a lot about how the rest of the world outside of America should get together and lower trade barriers as a response. So I'm interested to know, are our leaders, Keir Starmer and co, even talking about that? And can you tell us a little bit more about how it would actually work? What do we need to do to reduce trade barriers? Keep up the good work, and thanks very much.
Thanks very much there from Tom, can't imagine who that was, from Malta. And Robert, this actually came up at Prime Minister's Questions today because you wrote a really interesting blog about it yesterday, and Ned Davey raised it at PMQs. What do you make of this idea then? How likely is it that countries could club together now to form some kind of free trade network in opposition to America?
So, look, my view is that the most rational response to a leader who is effectively a bully, and that's what Trump is to stand up to it. Because, any of us who've experienced bullies in our lives, beginning when we were at school, you give the bully your dinner money, he's going to come back for more the next day. The way to see to face a bully down is to, get together with your entire class and just say, you've now got to take us all on.
Is the risk, though, that the Keir Starmer's thinking about is we stand up to America, we don't need America economically anymore. Donald Trump gets so upset that he says, well, you need us to help defend Ukraine. You're never going to defeat Russia without America. If you're standing up to me on tariffs, I'm not going to be sending weapons to Ukraine anymore.
Obviously, part of thinking throughout the West is you don't want to alienate America to the extent that they, essentially abandon NATO and abandon Ukraine. And of course, you've got to take that on board. I don't think Starmer will show leadership of this sort. He's made, and he may be right, but he's made a decision that we have to negotiate on our own to try and get a better deal than the rest of the world on tariffs. But there is somebody else who everybody in the UK knows well, because he was governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who is currently the Prime Minister of Canada. He's about to, face an election there, and it's astonishing how his political fortunes have surged in standing up to Trump. He is probably the best qualified leader in the world to lead a coalition of this sort, because not only was he governor of the Bank of England and governor of the Bank of Canada, but he was also chairman of something called the Financial Stability Board, and he, more than anybody, knows how to put together coalitions of international countries on really difficult issues. In his case, he did it in the case of finance. And I would not be surprised, in fact, my understanding is that he absolutely buys this argument. As you know, he has been way more critical of Trump. Maybe it is the case that sort of the habits of negotiating as an individual country are so deeply ingrained that this cooperation will be impossible. But if it's impossible, I have to say we will get suboptimal outcomes, because in the end Trump will win. He'll pick us off one by one.
Can individual consumers, though, do anything about it? We've got an audience question here, for example. Can you foresee a UK boycott of US goods? I was in Canada recently. That's exactly what they've done there. They've put American goods on the bottom shelf in supermarkets, or the top shelf where people aren't typically looking at them. They put Canadian flags on all of their produce. It's a real patriotic sense now when you go to the supermarket that you're serving Canada by picking up those Canadian goods. Can you see the UK consumers going down that road?
People are already boycotting Tesla, aren't they? For different reasons. So
related reasons, yeah.
It can happen. I just don't feel like British people see American goods enough to know what they're boycotting.
No, we were discussing this. You don't often come across a made in America, do you? On a
you don't.
Not on our food anyway, or our clothing, or the things we buy every day.
You don't. But I have encountered surprising numbers of people who are so angry about so many things that Trump are doing that they are, quite a lot of people have volunteered to me that they are going out of their way to think about whether or not, a product, Procter & Gamble, huge American company, creates, manufactures all sorts of stuff we get in our supermarkets and all the rest of it. And I have met, quite a lot of people who are saying they are thinking very hard about how to not buy American. And so, this could become an economic problem. I have to say, I also encounter quite a lot of people who voted Labour in the last election who are so angry with Starmer for the way that they think that he is placating somebody who they believe is doing significant harm to the world in multiple ways, not just with tariffs, but they don't like his cozying up to Putin. They don't like, the way that they think he is endorsing a policy by Netanyahu, which is leading to, many more deaths of Palestinians. I mean, we've got local elections coming up, and I'm encountering lots of people who voted Labour who are saying, I will vote anything but Labour in the local election.
You can understand the frustration, though, of people who voted Labour, because it just looks a bit wimpy that Keir Starmer's holding on. Oh, maybe he won't punish us. Maybe he won't. He still likes us, doesn't he? I mean, what's the evidence that Trump actually applies any special treatment to the UK? Nothing so far, really.
Oh, no, I don't think that's... So, it is not... So, you're right that let's just see whether he does anything in policy terms that is sort of beneficial in some shape or form. But, that look of joy, in the Oval Office when he read the invitation from King Charles. I mean, that was real. Right? I mean, I was there. I mean, that was extraordinary. He loves the royal family.
It's a cultural draw for him there.
What would Nigel Farage and Nigel Farage's supporters think? Because they want the UK to be strong. They want the UK to stand up to people who start on us. Would they think that it's the patriotic thing to do to go back and hit America with tariffs, or would they think, actually, let's just let America walk all over us?
So you're right that I think how Reform and Farage handle this will be very interesting.
Particularly when they allege that we sort of subjugated ourselves to the EU, and then we could end up subjugating ourselves to America.
Well, I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I have found sort of horrifying is that, the argument of the Brexiters was one of the big arguments of the Brexiters for leaving the EU was we had to take back complete control over our taxes. We didn't like the idea that Brussels had any kind of influence over the taxes that we set here. And yet, one of the things that has been negotiated, I've talked about this on the podcast before, has been as a result of pressure from Trump. One of the things that's been negotiated as part of this potential trade deal is a reduction or abolition of the digital services tax, which is a completely fair tax on the digital giants. And if we cave to America on the digital sales tax and reduce it, that is a million times more of an encroachment on our sovereignty than following EU rules on taxation. And because broadly all that we're happening there is we're allowing essentially a bully to bully us into doing something on tax. At least in the case of the EU, when we were members, we had a voice.
We want to finish off by talking about Rachel Reeves. We've all interviewed her, and I got the chance to dig a little deeper 4 years ago. I can't believe it's 4 years now. Lewis, you were the producer of this podcast. When I interviewed her for another podcast that we had at the time called Acting Prime Minister, which offered political figures the chance to tell me what they'd do if they entered Downing Street. Labour at the time of this interview were trailing the Tories by 14 points in the polls. It was a whole other era. Now things have changed considerably, and they just switched leader, of course, from Corbyn to Starmer. This is Rachel Reeves in 2021 laying out her vision for power. If she was ever given the keys to number 10, of course, in the end she got them to number 11. Let's have a listen to it. Who's the first person you'd call as Prime Minister?
I think I'll probably phone up my children because they don't know that Labour wins elections. So I think they'd be delighted that there was a Labour person in number 10 Downing Street.
Tell me what Labour stands for then in these days under Keir Starmer. What is the party's ethos?
Labour are the party of ordinary working people and working families who have not had a good deal. Our communities and our town centres and our high streets have been hollowed out this last 10 years because of austerity, but also because the Tories, I think, neglect the things that matter to most of us in our everyday lives.
What song would you dance to at party conference?
I love Beyonce. Now I can only think of the one that I danced to at my wedding, which was Crazy in Love.
Well, that was the bell that you could hear sounding there, the division bell, because she had to go and vote in Parliament, but she'd rather stay and talk about Beyonce, it turned out, which I was very happy about. So now, Lewis, she was talking to me about Beyonce. She talked to you about Sabrina Carpenter the other day, because, of course, she got into a whole fix about all of that. Now, listen to Lewis's interview 4 years on. He was the first one to interview her after the spring statement.
Aren't these cuts that you've announced recently just showing that we are moving towards austerity 2.0?
Oh, no. I mean, this is a far cry from what we saw in the Conservative years. In the budget last year, compared to what I inherited from the Conservatives, we put £190 billion into the day-to-day spending of government.
There's around 1 million young people out of work. We need to boost defence to help defend Ukraine. Some people would say, well, why don't you force those 18-year-olds who are not working to join the military, bring in national service?
I'm not in favour of national service, but there are vacancies in our armed forces and we need to recruit more people.
You're taking a bit of flack for accepting Sabrina Carpenter tickets, but what's your favourite Sabrina Carpenter song?
In the job that I'm doing now, it is harder to do some of those normal everyday things. Now, don't get me wrong, this job is a privilege of my life, but I do now have security and just doing things like, going to a pop concert, which I'd love to be able to do with my kids. I just can't do that in the way that I could before. I did enjoy the song, so please, please, please.
I mean, Lewis, when you saw Rachel Reeves right after the spring statement, did you get the sense that she felt relieved having delivered it, or did she still seem very anxious about how it was going to go down?
She was very smiley when we did the interview. I feel like she'd probably been preparing for that moment for a long time, and obviously she prepared for my interview for even longer, but it did feel like she felt like she could let her hair down a little bit. That Sabrina Carpenter question, I did not expect I was going to get an answer on.
She enjoyed that question.
Yeah, by the end of it, she enjoyed it. But I thought it was quite interesting on the podcast that you did 4 years ago, which is great if anyone wants to listen back. It's really interesting to see how much she's changed. But she talked about how she was a superstar at chess at school. And I feel like it's sort of like she's playing chess now. She's making her big moves at the start of the game. We don't really know if the overall plan is going to work. And she's it feels like she's making calculated moves that we really won't know if they're going to work until the end of the chess game or the end of the parliament.
What I love about putting those two clips side by side is it shows the difference in tone between opposition and government, right? She was so much more restrained when she was talking to you, even though you did an excellent job of getting answers out of her. Whereas when I interviewed her, she was in the shadow cabinet, and yet she was so relaxed. And I mean, they were, 3 years out from a general election. They looked like they had absolutely no prospect of winning power at that point. I guess she could be relaxed, but she's definitely had to sort of tighten up, hasn't she, since she's gone into government?
It's more than that, though, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of slightly sad in a way,
like
watching it, because you can just see, when you interviewed her, she was sort of lively, laughing, chatty, and then the cares of office, right? It's astonishing the way they weigh on you. I mean, she almost looks like a different person just because she's not as animated. And, I don't want to say, oh God, I don't know whether this is tactless, but she looks much older. And,
they do say people look a lot older when they leave office,
and it is, and I think a lot of that is just the pressure on you. Yeah. I don't think any of us should underestimate, particularly if you're Chancellor at such a difficult time, and you've had to do so many controversial things. The pressures are absolutely enormous.
If you search on the internet for photos of prime ministers in particular when they enter office and when they leave, and even if they only leave 2 or 3 years later, as we've had with Theresa May and Boris Johnson, the change is extreme. I mean, Boris Johnson had COVID, so you've got to give him.
He hasn't gone grey yet, like Stan.
But the thing that was
the change.
But the thing, the person who I experienced this most starkly about, because obviously I've been doing this
forever,
taking interest in this for far too long. But I remember, so in the run up to the 1997 election, John Major just looked more and more weary and older, and then literally within about a month or two of losing the election, he looked about 10 years younger. It was extraordinary.
It's quite similar with Ed Miliband. Like when he was leader of the opposition, he was terrible with the media, and now he's not. I mean, he's got responsibility, but not as much responsibility. He is so relaxed.
Yeah, and ditto Rishi Sunak. Right, I've seen Rishi Sunak since he lost the election, and he not in a personal capacity, in a work capacity I had, and he looks a much happier man and a much younger man, actually, even though he was a relatively youthful prime minister.
I think one should just not underestimate, whether you're a chancellor, and in particular, one of the things that ministers tell me is, and I wonder how any of us would cope, but if you get the top level of security clearance and, you sit on the various national security committees, the things you get told about the threats to the nation are stuff that I think most people would prevent most people sleeping at night, right? And you just have to, you get told it, and you got to you can't tell anybody about it. And so I do genuinely think that one underestimates the sort of burden that is put on these people.
Yeah, how do they sleep at night? I mean, there's so many things to worry about, not least of all the politics of it all. Thank you so much for that, both of you. That is all that we've got time for today, but Robert will be back with snap analysis on the tariffs in a special episode on Thursday, once we know what those tariffs are going to be. And if you haven't already subscribed on YouTube or any podcast platform to make sure you never miss an episode, please do that too. Thanks so much for joining us.